Welcome to today's episode of People and Strategy. I'm your host, Mo Fatalbab, President of International Facilitators Organization. People and Strategy is a podcast from the SHRM Executive Network, the premier network of executives in the field of human resources. Each week, we bring you in-depth conversations with the country's top HR executives and thought leaders. For today's conversation, I'm excited to be joined by Leah Marone, psychotherapist and corporate mental wellness consultant. Her first book, Serial Fixer, is coming out in November. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Leah, tell us about your career journey and what brought you to the role of corporate mental wellness consultant.
Oh, my career journey. Okay. Well, I've started out, kind of the foundation of it all is I'm a psychotherapist. So I think from a very young age, I loved learning just about people. I loved learning about resilience. I loved learning about how people interpret things and how it affects their behavior and all the things, around just psychology. And so that led me into the field of psychology and clinical social work. And so the foundation, whether it's working in loss and grief centers, out in the community, juvenile justice, really was out and about doing all of that. And then when I had started a family, I wanted to be able to kind of have that dual role and flexibility of being mom, being wife, and also clinician, which led me more to private practice work and specializing in anxiety disorders, working with athletes, mood disorders, grief and loss. And I had a few clients that, were coming in for therapy and they were in leadership positions. And I had one in particular say, we would love for you to come talk to our team. Like we would love, I would love for you to share some of the things that we've been working on with boundaries, with self-awareness, with anxiety management and just burnout in general and come talk to my team. And I really, to be, quite honest, that was so igniting to me. And I loved the combination of the intimacy of individual therapy and then kind of this macro level of speaking and teaching and facilitating. And so that really led me to, again, this thirst for larger groups and facilitating this learning on that level. And it just has kind of morphed from there. And opportunities have come along. And of course, it's all under the umbrella of mental health. But I'm really enjoying the variety and the diversity of just roles that I can play and the different spaces I can create for people.
I love all that. And there's so much to dig into, from resilience to burnout to just saying no and putting up boundaries. Let's start with burnout. So first of all, what are the signs of burnout? How does one know that they've gotten close to it or even over the line and are burned out?
Right. And that's a great question. I know we've been talking a lot about burnout, especially, the last five-ish years. But it's one of those topics that we don't want to get there and then it be almost like we're knee deep or even neck deep in burnout. Burnout is when we feel like we're kind of zombie-like. We're kind of going through the motions. There's this flat affect. We're maybe able to sustain certain roles or do it, but we're not really invested. It's almost like we're kind of watching ourselves do these things. And the passion that we may have had, the connection that we may have had with ourselves in this role or other people, it's really hard to grasp. And so it's this kind of mechanical, robotic, flat, just almost movement through life. And a lot of times you'll feel a heightened sense of irritability. You'll feel patience go out the window. You'll feel kind of your hope meter decrease, and just parts of you that were once ignited or parts of you that craved certain things and almost like diversity on your plate are hard to find. They become almost dormant. And so burnout, again, I think it kind of rises the critical part in us where we wonder, what is wrong with me? And we start sometimes to reach for blame outside of us. We try to pinpoint different things, which might be true, but a lot of times it's this intense disconnect with us and the ability to create these boundaries, fuel what we need to fuel, and really take time to generate that self-connection.
So beautiful stuff. And I want to dig into the irritability bit just for a second. Is it always tied to burnout? Because it seems to me that somebody could be irritable and maybe not be burnt out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, irritability can come in a lot of different forms and have a lot of different triggers, right? But I think that irritability and lack of patience, it's a really good indicator that your plate is full, right? Your plate is full, or the mental, kind of the conflicts that are going on internally are wearing you out. And so the inability to be present, the inability to find that passion and that purpose and all of that, those things that we talk about and that I think we strive for, they're just non-existent, or they seem that way. But irritability and I think lack of patience, even lack of attention, all of those things, when we are at capacity, when we're walking around with this full bloom, those things are hard to engage in. Sometimes it's hard to give people then the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes it's hard to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt and see the silver linings because, again, we're operating at capacity.
So let's talk about resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Resilience isn't putting up with being at capacity, is it? Or how do you define resilience?
Yes. Resilience is one of those things that we need to continue to build. It's a muscle that we need to continue to flex and build. And you're exactly right. It's not putting up with certain things, but let's be real. There's certain things in life we do have to kind of trudge through. We do have to say, you know what? Yeah, I got to take this for the team, or yeah, this is the way that this is, but I'm aware of it. I'm going to validate it. I'm also going to give myself a chance to recover or reframe or rejuvenate myself. And if you think about an athlete, with resilience, there are built-in times for those that are really training at a high level. There are built-in times for recovery. There are built-in times for resets, because otherwise they're prone to injury. They're prone to that type of burnout, right? And they're not going to be able to peak and sustain. And so the same types of things go with us when it comes to our mental and emotional health. And I think that's one of the biggest things about resilience is it's not about, maintaining at this very high level and kind of always being on. It's the ability to acknowledge this is challenging, or this might be out of my control, but I have enough in my resilience bag that I'm going to be able to grab it. I'm going to be able to execute it, or trust that I'm resourceful enough to look for someone to structure and support. And then I'm going to find ways to go right back up. And I trust that I'm going to be able to do that. That's resilience. And it takes self-awareness.
And my understanding of resilience is that it's how quickly you bounce back. So stuff is going to happen. And if you're resilient, you bounce back more quickly. Is that part of how you define it?
I think it is. And of course, it depends on the challenge. It depends on the certain circumstance in life, whether it's kind of a short burst or if it's something that's very situationally draining and hard and has a lot of layers. But yeah, it's that ability to bounce back. And I think the thing that's, one of the most intricate and primary parts of resilient is that self-trust, right? It's trusting and having enough repetitions or reps under your belt that you trust that you are going to be able to find a way or pull from past data or whatever it may be to start taking steps, even if they're this big.
Yeah. So Leah, we know that HR leaders want to help others, and this can sometimes lead to burnout, compassion fatigue. How do you see this show up with your clients? And what's the aha moment where they realize that, oh boy, I got to set some boundaries?
Right. And oftentimes I love it when we can catch this before it's never too late, but that, you're always, again, when they're in the thick of it, you're like, so it's really good. And I'm glad that, we're having this opportunity to talk about some of the things to put in place to kind of prevent yourself from this burnout cycle where you're really low and then you kind of peak and you're like, okay. And then you kind of replicate the whole thing again. But yes, I think HR professionals, you look at educators, you look at, healthcare providers, you look at people in general that are, that move or are attracted to fields that do require you to create space for others, do require higher levels of compassion oftentimes and empathy at times. Those are wonderful gifts. But oftentimes what I'm finding is that people within those fields are generally more so prone to that compassion fatigue and burnout because people with higher levels of empathy and compassion tend to be pretty awful sometimes at setting boundaries. And why that is oftentimes is because if I kind of go inward a little bit, the voice inside of us that sometimes I like to coin as our inner pleaser is very much, in tune with what other people think about us, how we're serving them. If we don't show up for them, if we don't come across as nice and kind and supportive and all of these things, then we're not doing our job. We're not, collaborating. Other people might think that we're not being a good team player or a good team leader or a good HR professional or a good mom or a good friend or all the things. And so this part in us, this pleaser part in us, is very driven to create these spaces, to be available often, which again, wonderful things, but oftentimes it surpasses the needs and the resets and things that, they need for themselves to keep those wonderful gifts afloat. And so I think that's one of the biggest things I see. And I know I've had to kind of do my own work with, Leah, what is your role in this relationship? What can you control? What are your options? How can you show up and be that space creator, but support and don't solve, and quit taking false ownership and coming to these relationships with this unnecessary pressure to alleviate this person, fix for this person, all of these things. I think that role that we're putting ourselves in, especially HR leaders often, is just something that oftentimes is not sustainable.
So it seems to me like there are downsides for both parties, for this people pleaser and for those around them who have come to rely upon that person. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of these, and we see it all the time in the professional world. It's like these micro codependencies, right? And, it's so interesting. And I'd like to even share, I'll call myself out here. I think
Please.
as a student, and this was, decades ago, but I can remember even as a grad student, I had a paper due. I was, frantically trying to get this done. And I can remember, running down the hall, but walking very fast, trying to find my professor to almost have him soothe, structure, tell me what to do. Cause it was, I was just at a loss. And so I had this urgent state. I had this anxious mindset. And I can remember walking into his office and kind of, probably barged into his office. And he immediately saw the emotions all over my face. And I said, hi, yeah, I have a question. I'd like for you to help me. I know the paper's due soon. Probably blah, blah, blah. And he looked up calmly from what he was doing and what he was writing. And he said, Leah, hi, I can tell what you have to say is very important, but I'm in the middle of something and I'm not going to be able to give you my full attention. So if we can find a time to circle back later this afternoon, let's do that. And as you can see, I remember that. And I remember the boundary that he set, but I remember feeling respected. I remember him, he could have very well multitasked that, Mo. He could have very well said, oh yeah, you turned in the last paper, right? You did pretty well. Yeah, I'm sure you'll get it. Read the rubric, you'll be fine. Yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. And I would have walked out like, okay, that wasn't helpful, but, and he just would have been on his way and I would have frantically been on mine. But what he did is in that couple hours before we met again, I was able to access more logic. I was able to prepare some actual questions. I was able to, regroup and recalibrate myself and keep ownership. And he was able to create space, but act as that supporter rather than that solver. And I think what happens in the dynamic, I think of even the workforce, is sometimes you have employees and team members that are lacking confidence in a certain way. We all are in some respects. But if we have a leader that is constantly structuring, fixing, giving advice right out of the gate to maybe make them feel like they're being a great leader and they're helping and fixing all the things, it's such a disservice. Because then these team members, we're missing the opportunity for them to keep growing. We're missing the opportunity for them to have some of those processing skills and having a misstep that they can learn from. And so, creating or having this mindset as a leader where you're, supporting and support, don't solve, I think is a wonderful way to not only empower and create space without dipping your hands and taking all this false ownership and being up at night with all these things that really in reality aren't yours to truly own. And then it gives people around you this opportunity to flourish, to build those muscles that we all want everyone to see so we can work collaboratively and keep going.
So you're resonating with me a lot because I'll throw myself under the bus here. And, sometimes in my pursuit of productivity, I don't leave enough space. And so how do I change my mindset and how could the space be beneficial? How do I come to believe that I need that space more so than the need to be productive at all times.
Yes, yes. Well, when we think about even space, when we think about just even self-care, a lot of times, the critical productive part of us will surface and be like, well, we don't have time for that. Or, that's probably not productive, or we'll figure all that out later. But in reality, if we really just look and focus on all of the dozens of transitions that are in our day just naturally, whether it's walking from one room to the next, whether it's the bigger transitions, maybe from work to home and home to work, transitioning roles, transitioning all these things that we're doing. Not capitalizing on every single one, but some of these, we are filling the gaps. We're, creating like, oh, well, I can check this, I can do this, I can check this off, rather than when we walk somewhere, where we go out and get the mail, not bringing our phone with us, not thinking through all these things, but really just, again, exercising our five senses. What's the weather like today? How am I doing? Maybe I can take a breath or two in this, 25 seconds. And these little bursts of mindfulness, these little bursts of resets that I think, unfortunately, we're cluttering. We have this urgent pace of, again, let me fill these, let me be productive with the hope that eventually I'll be able to relax, recover, and do all these things, but then we're out of shape with it, and we can't. And that's when all of our clutter rises up and anxiety starts to surface oftentimes. So I think what I would suggest is, being incredibly mindful of how you're filling your transitional times throughout the day, whether when you're in the car, whether you're going for a walk, whether you're in the shower. Are there 15 things and bells and whistles that you're listening to? Are you brushing your teeth and walking around the house and, loading the laundry and feeding the dog? Or are you taking these routine things that you do and just getting more comfortable with checking in? Looking at yourself in the mirror, God forbid, or just taking a quick data collection of how am I at, or where am I at, what's going on? And you don't necessarily have to fix and solve and overanalyze, but just connecting with ourselves lets some of that air out of our balloon.
So I have 100 emails in my inbox, and I'm tempted to do my email in the shower, while I'm walking, while I'm in every step of my life. How do I get over that?
Yes. And this is where the self-trust comes in, right? Because the critical part of you, if you don't take all of those opportunities, that critical part is, he's front and center, he's got steering wheel, and he's saying, Mo, then you're going to get behind. Then you're going to really have some severe consequences. Then if you don't respond to these emails in a good time, people are going to question just how hard you're actually working, if you're actually collaborating with them. All of these things, we create all these false narratives, we create all these scenarios, and it's this lack of trust that if we take a shower, God forbid, and just, feel the water and just kind of practice a bit of mindfulness and relaxation, that part of us does not necessarily trust that we will be able to transition out of that and that everything will be okay. And that burst of rejuvenation actually will lead to further productivity and less multitasking. And that's the muscle we have to build. And that's the part where we have to soothe the critical part of us, but first and foremost, validate it, understand what it's trying to potentially protect us from, which as humans, it's normally in the category of failure, embarrassment, shame, disconnect, all those things that as humans we do not want to do or feel. And that is what our critic is trying to protect us from. But oftentimes they come in way too strong. And then we're left with this urgent feeling, we're left with this disconnect, and we're left out of shape with recovering and relaxing.
Yeah. So, Leah, what are some of the most common issues you're seeing these days in terms of your patients and their needs, and what's kind of the macro view?
Yes. I mean, it kind of to piggyback on what we were just discussing, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing, I think with and this just isn't pertaining to one generation, but being out of shape oftentimes with just being and not having stimulation, and I think, even when it comes to self-care, I have clients that will come in, I have teams that I'm working with, and I'll even ask, what do you tend to do for yourself? And it's so interesting that many times people will share something, whether it's, in the form of exercise or engaging in watching a show or whatever. And as I dig a little bit deeper, they're multitasking when it comes to their self-care. Like they're doing 4 things at once normally. It's like, and oftentimes it's like, well, then we're kind of Xing this out. Like when you are exercising, checking your email, doing all these other things and being 50 places at once, it's like, yeah, your body's moving, but you're not connecting with what you're actually doing and you're not reaping the benefits emotionally and mentally. And that's a shame because I think the time that we're putting in for these things, it's a shame that we're not reaping the benefits. So I think getting in better shape with just capitalizing on those transitions, capitalizing on those times where we can just be doing one thing at a time.
So Leah, for HR executives, as they deal with sometimes emotionally charged situations and they want to be helpful, and as we discussed, they need to set boundaries and be present and take a beat. And what kind of reps can they do to practice this notion of being and actually being whole at the same time without always being there for someone else?
Right. And again, I just want to highlight this is such a gift and it's such a wonderful quality to want to help and serve and soothe people. And we don't want to diminish that. But we also want to find that fine line and incorporate some boundaries so that it's not then taxing to you and exhausting to you, where you then are finding yourself in this cycle of burnout or compassion fatigue. And so one of the, I think, first things to do to generate some self-awareness and get some reps in, I think, is to really take a step back in your relationships. Again, with those you may lead, those that, even personal relationships. And just maybe take some notes or think about in real time, collect data on yourself with how you tend to show up to these conversations. And these are not concrete, kind of matter of fact conversations. These are the one where someone might be asking for, what do I do next? Or maybe is coming to you with a really intense emotion. And I know HR professionals are in front of that a lot. And so it's removing that pressure of knowing exactly what to say, how to suit this person, how can I solve for this person, but rather think of yourself as how do I create space for this person? And very first step out of the gate, whether it's your child, your partner, a team member, someone you're leading, how can I validate them? And validation is first, the energy that it takes to try to understand what someone might be feeling or the message that they're trying to communicate to you, verbally or non-verbally. And so when we first create the space and have this cue to let me validate this person, it immediately moves us into this role where we are supporting and we are aligning and we are not jumping in with the pressure of how do I fix, solve, alleviate, which then leads to sometimes taking that false ownership, creating sometimes these micro codependencies, and then you're off to the races. And many people that, go into conversations and immediately give advice, immediately try to fix, and generally with very good intentions, are finding this, it's taxing. It's a lot. And we're missing the boat with how we can then empower and leave that ownership with other people. So that would be something that, you can take away and you can really see like, oh, yes, I'm doing that often. And maybe some of that might be ego driven to prove to myself that I know what I'm talking about. I'm a good leader. People rely on me. I'm needed. This is my purpose. We got to be real with that stuff. But then shelve that for a minute and see how, if you show up and you validate first and you start to ask questions that can help people process and find their options and how you can support and keep that ownership with them. It's amazing leadership. It's amazing parenting. It's amazing in all levels, but it also prevents you from the cycles again of burnout and compassion fatigue. You're not serial fixing.
So not fixing, not giving advice. I love all that. How does one validate? So let's say I don't know anything about this validation notion. How do I validate someone?
Yes, great question. And I think oftentimes we confuse validation with agreeing, and that's not the case. So if you think about one of the classic examples, and I see this a lot of times in my office, is, if I have a couple come in or a family come in and we're working on validation, I also have to remind them, like, you may not agree with anything that person just said. You may not agree. You may have a completely different thought process, or you interpreted that argument, that situation completely different.
But the practice, and it's very challenging sometimes, but the practice is to say, so you're saying this, or I heard this, or, sometimes even validating by saying, that sounds like a lot, or no, I can tell that you're very stressed. Sometimes that paraphrasing, sometimes that, asking for clarification, sometimes just saying, this is what I'm hearing. Is that right? It takes a level of patience. It takes reps to get yourself into that mode. But man, does it create collaboration rather than two people against each other sometimes, or again, a hierarchical structure. And once you start to realize that, it's amazing how the pressure becomes eliminated and you start to gain the self-trust that you are going to be able to navigate all types of interactions.
Wonderful. Last question, Leah. What is one piece of advice that has shaped your life or work the most?
Ooh. I'm going to have to pull one from childhood. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I was a basketball player, living where Travis is right now. And I think that one resonates with me so much because not just on the court was that something that, I could hear my coaches saying, but it's also just in life, it's go for it. Sometimes welcome and embrace the discomfort. Take your shot. There's going to be a lot of shots that come your way. And gosh, when we hesitate, when we allow our inner critic to give us all these scenarios of what if you fail? What if you feel uncomfortable? What if, people don't think you're competent? What if this and this and this? We're missing shots left and right. And so I think that's been a big motto for me, not only as an athlete, but as a professional and the person. Just be on the hunt for these shots, Leah, and go ahead and take them. And you're not going to make and slam dunk or, swoosh every one. But that's not the point. Just get your shot in and build from there.
And that's where we'll end it for this episode of People in Strategy. A huge thanks to Leah for your valuable insights. You can follow the People in Strategy podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, podcast reviews have a real impact on podcast visibility. So if you enjoyed today's episode, leave a review to help others find the show. Finally, you could find all our episodes on our website at shrm.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
SHRM.